You press the accelerator, but the engine revs while the car barely speeds up. That slipping feeling is often the first warning that something inside the automatic transmission is no longer holding power correctly. But which part is actually failing, and how does one small problem cause the entire transmission to lose grip? We're going to look inside and follow the failure from the first symptom to the final breakdown. To understand what's failing, you first need to understand the one thing a transmission has to do perfectly. It has to grip. Here's the core idea that everything else depends on. Inside your automatic transmission, power is passed along by parts physically clamping onto each other, holding tight so that when the engine spins, the wheels spin with it. When everything is healthy, that grip is total. There's no slack, no slippage. The engine turns, and every bit of that turning is transferred through. Slipping is simply what happens when that grip fails. The engine still spins, but the connection to the wheels is loose, so the power leaks away instead of pushing you forward. That's why the engine revs up while the car barely moves. The engine is working, but the transmission isn't holding on to its effort. So the real question of this whole video is, what makes that grip let go? To answer that, we need to look at what's actually doing the gripping. Inside the transmission are stacks of clutch plates. Picture a series of flat discs, alternating, one connected to the input side, the next to the output side, over and over, interleaved like a deck of cards shuffled together. Some of these plates are bare steel, and the ones between them are coated with a special high-friction material, almost like the material on a brake pad. When the transmission wants to lock power through, it squeezes this whole stack together. The friction material grabs the steel, the plates lock as one solid unit, and power flows through with a firm total grip. That squeezing, that clamping of the clutch pack, is the single action your entire transmission depends on. And now we can watch exactly how it fails. Here's where the trouble begins, and it starts smaller than you'd expect. Every single time those clutches clamp and release, which is constantly, every gear change, every launch from a stop, that friction material rubs. And just like the pads on your brakes, it slowly wears away. This is completely normal for a while, but as the friction material gets thinner, two things happen. The plates can no longer be squeezed as tightly, and the worn-away material doesn't just vanish. It breaks off into tiny particles that contaminate the fluid. So the very first stage of failure is subtle. The clutches begin to grip just slightly less firmly than they used to. You might feel it as a tiny hesitation, a soft shift, a moment where the car feels a beat behind your foot. That's the beginning. But here's what turns a small problem into a spiral, and it's the single most important thing to understand about transmission failure. When a clutch grips slightly less than perfectly, it starts to slip, even just a little. And slipping creates friction, and friction creates heat. That heat is the enemy. Because the fluid inside your transmission isn't just there for lubrication. It's doing critical work, and heat destroys it. As the slipping generates heat, the fluid begins to break down. And here's the vicious part. Degraded fluid can't create as much clamping pressure and can't cool the clutches properly, so the clutches slip more, which creates more heat, which damages the fluid further, which makes the clutches slip even more. This is a feedback loop, a downward spiral, and once it really gets going, it accelerates. A transmission that was slipping just slightly can go downhill surprisingly fast, because every stage of the failure makes the next stage worse. That covers how the slipping begins and why it snowballs. Now let's follow that spiral down to what's actually breaking, because the clutches are only where you feel the symptom, not always where the root problem lives. Because here's the thing many people get wrong. The clutches slipping is often the symptom, not the original cause. Let's follow the power deeper, because behind those clutches are two other suspects. The first is the pressure system. Remember, the clutches are clamped by hydraulic pressure, fluid squeezed hard against them. That pressure is generated by a pump and directed by a maze of channels and valves called the valve body. If the pump is worn or a valve in the valve body sticks or leaks, the transmission simply can't push the clutches together hard enough anymore, even if the clutches themselves are fine. Perfectly good clutches will slip if nothing is pressing them together with enough force. So sometimes the failure isn't worn clutches at all. It's a loss of the pressure that was supposed to be squeezing them. The second hidden suspect is the fluid itself, and this is the one most within your control. We already saw how heat degrades fluid, but fluid also simply ages, gets old, gets dirty, gets full of those worn friction particles, and loses its ability to transfer pressure and carry away heat. Low fluid does the same thing. If there's a leak and the level drops, there isn't enough fluid to build proper pressure or cool the parts, and the clutches slip and cook. An enormous number of transmission failures don't start with a broken part at all. They start with fluid that was old, burnt, or low, quietly starving a perfectly good transmission of the pressure and cooling it needed. So now let's put the whole chain together, from that first slip to the final breakdown. It usually goes like this. The fluid gets old or low, or the clutches wear slightly. Grip becomes imperfect. That causes a little slipping. Slipping creates heat. Heat destroys the fluid further. Weaker fluid means weaker clamping and worse cooling, which causes more slipping, which makes more heat. Round and round, each lap worse than the last. And the final stage? Eventually, the friction material wears away completely, down to the bare backing, or the fluid is so degraded and the pressure so low that the clutches can no longer grip at all. At that point, the transmission can't transfer power. The engine revs freely, the car won't move, and what started as a faint hesitation months ago has become a complete loss of drive. The breakdown wasn't one sudden event. It was the last step of a long, quiet chain. And that leads to the most valuable part of this whole video, the part that can actually save you thousands of dollars, the early warning signs and what to do about them. Because this failure is slow, and that means it's catchable. The very first symptoms are subtle. A slight delay when you shift into drive or reverse. A soft, hesitant, or jerky gear change. A momentary flare in engine RPM during a shift, that little rev that shouldn't be there. And one you can literally smell, a burnt, acrid odor, which is the smell of overheated, degrading transmission fluid. If you ever notice any of these, that is the window. That is the transmission telling you it's early in the spiral, not late. And here's the single most important, most actionable thing in this entire video. Because so many of these failures start with the fluid, checking and changing your transmission fluid on schedule is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy. A fluid change costs a small fraction of what a rebuilt transmission costs. A transmission replacement is one of the most expensive repairs on the entire car. If you catch it while it's just a fluid problem, you may fix it for very little. If you ignore the early slipping and let the spiral run, you're often replacing the whole unit. The difference between those two outcomes is usually just paying attention early. That is how an automatic transmission fails. From a slight loss of grip, into slipping, into heat, into ruined fluid and worn clutches feeding on each other, all the way down to a transmission that can no longer hold power at all. A slow spiral that almost always whispers a warning long before it shouts. If this helped you understand what happens inside a slipping transmission, go ahead and subscribe for more car breakdowns. Next, we can break down how an automatic transmission works from the ground up, how the torque converter multiplies your engine's power, or how to actually read the warning signs your car is giving you before a breakdown. The more you understand what's happening under the hood, the better decisions you can make as a car owner. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.